As dusk settled over the snow-laced grass at the edge of Silver Pine Wildlife Preserve, the wind carried the scent of pine and cold promise. The sky was streaked with bands of fading lavender and orange, the world holding its breath as darkness crept closer. Hazel, the youngest bobcat of her small family, crouched low in the brittle weeds, muscles tight, ears twitching. Her amber eyes never left the silhouette of a mule deer moving just beyond the frozen creek. Hazel's mother, lean and scarred from years in the wild, signaled with a flick of her tail. Her older brother, bold but inexperienced, mirrored her tension. Tonight, food was not just hunger. It was survival. The air itself felt sharper, as if the forest was watching and waiting. Somewhere nearby, a raven croaked, its harsh voice echoing the risk that shivered through every whisker on Hazel's face. Suddenly, the deer paused. Its breath puffed in white clouds as it sniffed the wind, head high, muscles rippling beneath its winter coat. Hazel's heart pounded so loud she thought the deer must hear it. The scent of fear mingled with anticipation, making her jaw ache. She had failed before, always outpaced, always watching her mother bring down the kill. Tonight, she needed to prove she could belong. A branch snapped. In one fluid burst, Hazel's family surged forward, their bodies becoming streaks of gold and shadow, claws tearing through icy grass. The deer bolted, hooves flashing as it bounded across the creek. Hazel lunged after it, every instinct ablaze, snow exploding under her paws. She could hear her mother's snarl, her brother's grunt, the crash of bodies through undergrowth. For a fleeting second, Hazel believed she was flying. Her world narrowed to the scent and shape of the deer, the wild rhythm of pursuit. But the deer was faster. Its panic turned to fury as it realized it was cornered against a fallen pine. Hazel, reckless in her hunger, rushed in, trying to outmaneuver the adult bobcats. Her claws grazed the deer's flank, but in the next heartbeat, the animal lashed out with its powerful back legs. Hazel had no time to react. Pain burst across her side as a sharp hoof caught her ribs. The world tumbled sideways. She hit the frozen ground hard, snow driving into her nose, the wind knocked from her lungs. For a moment, she saw only black and the wheeling stars above. When she tried to move, agony screamed up her leg. She gasped, trembling, her body refusing to obey. Around her, the hunt had shattered. Her mother's wild call echoed in the trees, followed by the frantic yowl of her brother. The deer broke free, blood streaking its coat, and vanished into the deepening shadows. Hazel was alone. Crows called overhead, their voices mocking, and the wind shifted, bringing with it a scent that made Hazel's blood run colder. Coyote. Desperation seized her. Using her uninjured paw, she dragged herself toward the shelter of the nearest pine, every movement an agony. She could feel blood seeping from her wound, soaking her tawny fur, the chill biting deeper than before. Distant howls rose, haunting, hungry, closing in with the promise of easy prey. She tried to yowl for her family, but her voice came out broken, more whimper than roar. The woods were a blur of black branches and drifting snow, every shadow a threat. Her instincts told her to hide, to vanish, to make herself small and silent. Her body screamed for warmth and safety. Hazel crawled beneath a tangle of fallen branches, pressing herself flat against the frozen earth. Her breaths came shallow and ragged, each one a struggle. The scent of pine sap filled her nose, masking, barely, the copper tang of her own blood. She lay trembling, heart beating like a trapped bird. Above, Storm clouds gathered, thick and bruised, blotting out the last slivers of daylight. Lightning flashed, far away but drawing closer, and thunder rumbled through the hills like a warning. The coyotes answered with a chorus that set every nerve in Hazel's body alight. Time warped, each minute stretching forever. Hazel's mind skittered between terror and instinct, memories of her mother's warmth and her brother's rough play flickering in and out. The pain in her side flared hot and cold, and she wondered, deep down, if she would ever see daylight again. Rain began to fall, icy and relentless. It soaked into Hazel's fur, mingling with blood and dirt, stealing what little warmth she had left. Still, she clung to life. She pressed her nose to the ground, seeking any remnant of her family's scent, but the rain washed everything clean. The world was only thunder, cold, and the distant threat of hungry predators. As darkness took hold, Hazel's consciousness faded in and out. She heard the scurry of small things in the brush, the snap of twigs, and now and then, the howl of a coyote too close for comfort. Each sound sharpened her fear, but her body grew weaker with every shivering breath. Yet, even as the storm raged and hope seemed lost, something fierce and stubborn survived within her. Hazel's wild heart beat on, alone, afraid, but unbroken. Beneath the fallen pine, she closed her eyes, ready to fight for dawn, whatever it might bring. Rain hammered the pine canopy, thundering against the earth in a relentless, icy torrent. Night had swallowed the forest whole. Every hollow beneath the trees was slick with shadow and mud. The storm was no passing squall. This was the kind of weather that stripped branches, flooded burrows, and drove even the hardiest creatures deep into hiding. But Hazel was too weak to run. She was trapped in her makeshift shelter beneath the fallen pine, her world shrinking with every shiver. The pain in Hazel's side burned hotter now, her wound sticky and foul-smelling. Each breath sent a jolt of agony through her ribs. The cold rain soaked through the tangled branches, chilling her to the bone, and her strength ebbed away with every drop. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind flickering between reality and half-remembered dreams. Sometimes she saw her mother's face, fierce and loving, calling her name. Sometimes the world dissolved into a haze of pain, thunder, and fear. Lightning flashed, closer now, and Hazel startled, her claws digging into the mud. The thunder that followed was deafening, shaking the ground beneath her. Instinct made her try to snarl, to show the world she was still dangerous, but her voice was just a weak hiss lost in the downpour. The fever took her next, burning through her body like a second storm. She saw strange visions in the darkness, a field of wildflowers in summer, her brother chasing grasshoppers, the warm, rough tongue of her mother grooming her fur. Sometimes she thought she heard the yip of a coyote or the shriek of an owl, but she couldn't tell if these were real or just fragments of fevered dreams. Her world was shrinking fast, every sense clouded by exhaustion and the sharp, sweet smell of infection. Somewhere, not far away, headlights cut through the swirling rain. Megan Carter had been working as a park ranger in Silver Pine for over 3 decades, but nights like this still unsettled her. The radio in her battered pickup crackled with weather updates and warnings, but Megan's mind was elsewhere. On the downed trees she needed to check, the flooded trails, and the strange, restless ache in her chest that always came with storms. Beside her on the cracked vinyl seat sat Baxter, her old golden retriever, his muzzle graying with age but his eyes as gentle as ever. He rode silently, nose pressed to the fogged window, occasionally glancing at Megan as if to ask, "Are we almost done?" But Megan barely noticed. Her thoughts circled her memories, landing again and again on the daughter she'd lost years before, and on the emptiness she still carried. Tonight, she told herself, would be just another storm, just another list of damages to report. She parked at the edge of the preserve, pulling on her raincoat and grabbing a flashlight. The rain stung her face as she stepped into the mud, boots sinking with every stride. She scanned the tree line, her flashlight beam catching on broken branches and pooling water, the white glare making the forest seem ghostly and unreal. Baxter stayed close, paws barely making a sound as he followed her through the undergrowth. He sniffed the air, ears perked, every sense alive to the strange scents and sounds of the night. Megan was used to his company. He was her anchor, her quiet shadow. But tonight, even Baxter seemed uneasy. She was almost ready to turn back when a sudden, desperate sound caught her attention. A rasping, broken cry somewhere to her left. Megan froze. Was it a bird? A fox? Another branch giving way? But then she heard it again, softer this time, a pitiful mewl that twisted in her chest. Megan pushed her way through the brambles, heart pounding. Her flashlight beam swept across the ground and landed on a pair of wild, golden eyes staring up from beneath a tangle of fallen pine. Hazel. The bobcat was barely recognizable as the fierce predator Megan knew she should be. She was soaked to the skin, fur plastered flat, ribs heaving with every breath. Her right side was smeared with blood and mud, and there was a strange, sickly odor in the air that made Megan's stomach clench. The animal's gaze was full of terror, pure, primal, the kind that comes from knowing you are prey in a world full of hunters. Hazel tried to pull herself deeper into her hiding place, but she was too weak. Megan knelt in the mud, moving slowly, speaking in a low, gentle voice. "Easy now. It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." Her words vanished into the storm, but she kept talking, more for her own sake than the bobcat's. She pulled a blanket from her pack, hands trembling, and draped it over Hazel's shivering form. Hazel hissed, tried to swipe at her, but the gesture was feeble. Megan hesitated, fighting every instinct that told her to back off, to let nature take its course. But something about the raw desperation in those golden eyes shattered her resolve. Gently, she slid her arms beneath the wounded bobcat, feeling the rapid, fluttering heartbeat against her chest. Hazel tensed, her body rigid with fear, but she did not fight. Megan rose, cradling the small, broken creature, and hurried back to the truck as the rain intensified. Baxter watched with silent concern, tail wagging once as Megan laid Hazel on the back seat, wrapping her tight in blankets. "Stay with me, girl," Megan whispered, voice cracking. "You're not alone. Not tonight." As she sped toward the sanctuary's clinic, windshield wipers slapping in time with her racing heart, Megan felt a strange mixture of dread and hope. She knew what the odds were for a wild animal this badly hurt. She'd seen it too many times before. Nature was not merciful. But tonight, the thought of leaving Hazel to die alone was more than Megan could bear. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the road ahead. Baxter leaned against Megan's shoulder, sensing her anxiety, but offering only silent comfort. Megan glanced in the rearview mirror at the fragile life bundled in blankets, rainwater pooling on the seat. She pressed harder on the gas, whispering promises to both herself and the wild, battered creature behind her. "You're going to make it," she murmured, her voice steady, full of determination she hadn't felt in years. You have to. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the old truck, a tiny ember of hope flickered, refusing to be extinguished. The first gray light of dawn crept over the mountains, casting Silver Pine Sanctuary in a cold, silvery glow. The storm had finally passed, but the land bore its scars. Branches scattered across the gravel drive, puddles shining like broken glass in the morning chill. Inside the clinic, all was silent, but for the hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic tick of the old wall clock. Hazel lay sprawled on a stainless steel table, wrapped in towels, her breath shallow and erratic. The scent of antiseptic stung her nostrils, foreign and sharp, so different from pine needles and wild grass. Every sound, every clink of a metal instrument, every murmur of voices sent ripples of panic through her battered body. Megan stood behind a pane of observation glass, arms folded tight across her chest. Her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, and the skin at her temples was creased in worry. She watched as Dr. Elaine Patel, the sanctuary's lead veterinarian, moved swiftly but gently around Hazel, her hands practiced and steady. Beside her, a young vet tech set out trays of syringes and gauze, glancing nervously at the wild animal sprawled in front of them. Baxter was curled up on a blanket just outside the glass, his eyes never leaving Megan. Every so often he'd lift his head, as if sensing her turmoil, and let out a quiet sigh. Megan drew comfort from his steady presence. Through every loss, every lonely night, Baxter had been her anchor, her last remaining constant in a world that sometimes felt like it was always shifting under her feet. Inside the clinic, Hazel's world was a blur of light and sensation. Human hands pressed against her fur, prodding, searching, bringing new pain. She tried to snarl, but her voice was a rasp, nothing like the fierce cries of her wild home. She heard words, compound fracture, infection, high fever, but they meant nothing to her. All she knew was that she was trapped, exposed, surrounded by creatures she could not understand. Dr. Patel worked quickly. She cleaned Hazel's wound, her movements both efficient and tender. She murmured softly to the young tech, instructing her on how to hold the IV line, how to avoid Hazel's claws. At one point, the Bobcat's eyes flickered open, wild and golden, locking with Megan's on the other side of the glass. For a moment, Megan was back in a different clinic, years ago. She remembered her daughter in a hospital bed, so small and pale, fighting an illness the doctors couldn't explain away. She remembered that helpless feeling, the agony of knowing you would do anything, give anything, just to keep someone alive, and yet having so little power. The memory crashed over her like a wave, and she pressed her forehead to the cold glass, blinking back tears. The hours dragged on. Sometimes Hazel lay eerily still, her chest barely rising. Other times she thrashed in a half-conscious panic, eyes wide, mouth open in silent protest. The clinic team administered fluids and painkillers, worked to lower her fever, wrapped her injured side in clean gauze. They spoke in hushed tones, moving with the quiet urgency that comes from knowing the outcome is uncertain. Megan stayed all night, pacing the narrow hallway outside the clinic. She drank cup after cup of bad coffee, her nerves buzzing, unable to shake the image of Hazel's broken body. The young volunteers who arrived at sunrise were surprised to find her there, but no one said a word. They just brought her another blanket, another thermos of tea, small gestures that meant more than she could say. Baxter was her silent shadow, always nearby. When Megan finally slumped onto a bench, He climbed up beside her, pressing his warm body against her hip. She stroked his fur absently, staring through the glass at Hazel, willing her to survive. Dr. Patel emerged around mid-morning, fatigue etched on her face. She spoke softly, knowing the stakes. "She's strong," she told Megan, "but it could go either way. The infection is bad, and she's badly dehydrated. If she makes it through the next 24 hours, her chances will be much better." Megan nodded, biting her lip. She felt the familiar ache of hope warring with dread. She wanted to believe, to trust that nature, so often cruel, might be merciful just this once. But she'd learned the hard way that happy endings were never guaranteed. Hazel drifted in and out of sleep, her dreams feverish and strange. Sometimes she remembered running through tall grass, her mother's scent guiding her. Other times she felt only the press of human hands, the sting of antiseptic, the cold of steel against her fur. Each time she opened her eyes, Megan was there, just a silhouette behind the glass, unmoving, but present. As the morning wore on, Hazel's breathing eased. Her fever dropped by a degree. Her pulse steadied. Megan, watching from her perch outside the clinic, dared to hope. She realized with a pang that the greatest battle was not medical at all. It was the vast, unbridgeable space between wild fear and human hope. Megan wanted desperately to reach Hazel, to comfort her, to make her understand that she was safe. But she also knew the truth. Wild things did not heal like people did. They didn't crave gentle words or soft blankets. They needed space, quiet, and the dignity of their own instincts. To truly help Hazel, Megan would have to let go of her need to fix everything. Night fell again, painting the sanctuary in shades of blue and silver. Megan watched Hazel sleep, her body curled tight, a flicker of life and wildness that refused to be extinguished. Baxter lay beside Megan, a silent anchor against the rising storm of worry. In that moment, Megan understood what was required of her. Not heroics, but patience. Not control, but trust. She whispered a promise, barely audible, carried on the breath of hope. "You're not alone, little one. Not anymore." And for the first time in years, Megan believed it. The next morning, snow drifted quietly past the clinic windows, frosting the world in delicate white. The preserve felt hushed and fragile, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Inside the recovery room, the battle for Hazel's life settled into an uneasy calm, a standoff between her wildness and the hands that tried to save her. Hazel floated in and out of awareness, her mind foggy with sedation. Sometimes she'd jolt awake, muscles twitching, memories of pain and panic still raw in her nerves. Other times, she simply lay still, watching the strange shapes of humans move beyond the glass, their voices distant and muffled. The world she'd always known was gone, replaced by bright lights and unfamiliar smells. Fear lingered, but the crushing terror was slowly being replaced by a wary curiosity. Megan became a constant presence, though she never crossed the line between comfort and intrusion. Sometimes she would sit for hours just outside the recovery pen, reading quietly or speaking in a low, soothing voice. She didn't expect Hazel to understand her words. Instead, she let her presence speak. "You are safe. No one here will hurt you." She made a habit of wearing the same blue jacket, its scent gradually mingling with the clinical tang of the sanctuary. She'd leave it draped over the chair nearest Hazel's enclosure, offering a piece of herself as a quiet reassurance. Baxter, as always, curled up at Megan's feet, silent but attentive. Occasionally, His tail would thump softly against the floor, a signal that he too was waiting, patient as the snow piling outside. The routine became a kind of rhythm. Vet techs came and went, checking Hazel's IV, changing her bandages, jotting notes on their charts. Hazel tolerated them, but she never let her guard down, always watching, always tense. If anyone moved too quickly, she'd flick her tail or flatten her ears, her message clear. I am not yours. Yet Megan's approach was different. She didn't try to pet Hazel or make eye contact. She simply sat, present and unhurried, reading aloud from whatever book she had in her lap. Some days it was nature poetry. Other days, stories about the history of the Colorado mountains. Megan's voice was steady and low, as if talking to herself more than to Hazel. But sometimes, when Megan paused mid-sentence, she'd notice Hazel's eyes on her, alert and questioning. As the days passed, small changes revealed themselves in subtle ways. Hazel's breathing grew deeper, her coat slowly regaining its luster. When the staff brought her food, she ate, at first, with desperate hunger, then more cautiously, licking the wounds on her side between each bite. She began to clean her face with tentative swipes of her paw, reclaiming a sliver of dignity in the sterile world. Still, there were moments of setback. Once, during a particularly loud thunderclap, Hazel panicked, hurling herself at the wire mesh in a blind frenzy. It took hours for her to calm down, crouched in the farthest corner, watching Megan with wide, unblinking eyes. Megan did not try to soothe her with touch. She only spoke softly, waiting until Hazel's trembling stopped. Other times, Hazel's gaze would linger on Megan and Baxter, her posture uncertain, caught between the urge to flee and a flicker of curiosity. Megan learned not to rush those moments. She watched Hazel with a gentle patience, knowing trust was not a gift to be demanded, but something that had to be earned, inch by inch. Nights were the hardest. The sanctuary was quiet, shadows long and shifting across the floor. Megan would sometimes dream of her daughter, those final weeks in the hospital, the helplessness, the guilt of not being able to do more. She'd wake in the middle of the night, breath tight, and find herself walking the halls of the clinic, checking on Hazel as if checking on a lost piece of herself. She would stand there in the blue-lit darkness, watching the Bobcat sleep. Baxter would lean against her leg, solid and comforting, the two of them keeping silent vigil. Megan wondered if Hazel dreamed of her family, the wild woods, the life she'd lost in the storm. Or maybe, Megan thought, she simply dreamed of surviving. One snowy afternoon, Hazel surprised them all. Megan was reading from an old field journal, her voice steady and low, when Hazel stretched out in her pen, her body elongated, tail flicking with slow confidence. She lifted her head, and for the first time, did not shrink away when Megan shifted her position. Instead, Hazel fixed Megan with a long, searching stare, not of fear, but of wary assessment. Megan stopped reading, holding Hazel's gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. That day, something changed. Hazel began to move with more assurance, exploring the edges of her enclosure, testing her injured leg with tentative steps. The staff took note, careful to reduce any loud noises and limit their movements around her. Megan continued her quiet routine, resisting every urge to reach through the mesh and stroke Hazel's fur. Instead, she celebrated each small victory, a single step, a bite of food, a fleeting moment of eye contact. Still, Megan wrestled with questions she could not answer. Was she saving Hazel for the wild, or would her presence tame something essential out of the Bobcat? Could Hazel ever return to her old life, Or would she always be a creature caught between two worlds? The guilt gnawed at Megan's resolve, a shadow that clung even to her brightest hopes. One evening, as the last light faded behind the mountains, Hazel approached the front of her pen, nose twitching. Megan sat perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. Hazel's eyes, once wild with pain and terror, now held a cautious brightness. She did not stay long, but for that brief moment, a fragile bridge of trust stretched across the chasm between them. Megan whispered, her words barely audible. "It's okay, little wild one. Take all the time you need." Baxter thumped his tail, the rhythm of hope echoing softly through the winter quiet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft, relentless, patient as the slow, steady healing of a wild heart. Spring arrived at Silver Pine in subtle whispers. The air grew softer, losing its bitter bite. Melting snow unveiled emerald blades of grass and the tentative stirrings of new life. Migrating songbirds returned in cheerful flocks, their music weaving through the pines. Yet for Hazel, this season of awakening brought a new set of trials, a test not of healing, but of survival. She had been moved to the outdoor rehabilitation pen, a half-acre enclosure fenced by sturdy wire and shaded with wild saplings. Here, the sanctuary staff hoped she would regain not only her strength, but the instincts that were her birthright. The smells were real again. Fresh sap, earth, the musk of mice burrowing under leaves. The cold floor was gone, replaced by real grass, real mud, real wind curling through her fur. Yet Hazel moved through it all with a limp, her injured leg stiffer than before, pain a constant shadow at her side. At first, every sound sent Hazel shrinking into cover. The bark of a distant dog, the rattle of keys at the gate, even the laughter of a volunteer from afar. These made her nerves sing with warning. But hunger soon forced her out. Scattered throughout the pen were live crickets, field mice, and small game, hidden for her to find. The first days were marked by failure. Hazel crept up on a mouse, but her pounce was clumsy. The prey escaped. She lunged at a bird, but her wounded leg dragged, and she tumbled headfirst into wet grass. Each defeat stoked her frustration, and yet, as the sun tracked across the sky, she never gave up. From a hidden perch behind tinted glass, Megan watched it all unfold. Her heart ached at every failed attempt, every bitter growl Hazel gave. She kept her distance, knowing that the hardest lessons could not be softened by comfort. Baxter sometimes sat beside her, muzzle pressed to the glass, as if rooting for Hazel in silent solidarity. Days turned into a week. Hazel learned to use her environment, crouching low beneath the wild rose bushes, lying motionless for long stretches, her tail flicking only at the very last moment. Her patience was a wild thing, sharpened by hunger and memory. Still, she struggled. On the far side of the pen, she discovered a set of prints, long, narrow, distinctly canine. Coyote. The sanctuary staff confirmed that a pack sometimes circled the outer fence at night, drawn by the scent of food and the hope of weakness. One evening, as dusk fell and the sky burned pink and gold, Hazel froze near the edge of her pen. The wind carried the pungent musk of coyote, and every hair on her back stood up. She crept along the fence, her body close to the ground, ears tuned to every distant yip and howl. Somewhere beyond the trees, a chorus of voices rose, hungry, wild, relentless. The danger was real, even if she was safe behind wire. That night, Hazel did not sleep. She crouched beside a thick cluster of ferns, eyes wide, body rigid with vigilance. The next morning, something shifted. Hunger sharpened her resolve, and fear gave way to cunning. She found a vole beneath a fallen log, waited, then struck, her injured leg trembling but steady enough for a killing bite. The taste of blood, the crunch of bone, sent a jolt of memory through her veins. For the first time since the failed hunt in winter, Hazel felt like herself. Megan, hidden behind the glass, wiped tears from her eyes. "She did it," she whispered to Baxter, who barked softly in reply. There was no applause, no cheering, just a deep, swelling pride mixed with the familiar sting of heartbreak. Survival in the wild was never gentle. Each lesson came with scars. That evening, Megan prepared a note for the sanctuary team. Hazel caught her own prey. Suggest reducing supplemental feed to encourage further hunting. The decision felt both right and cruel. She remembered her daughter's struggle in the hospital, how she too had wanted to shield her child from pain, only to learn that some fights must be faced alone. There was an ache in letting go, but also a strange hope. As days warmed, Hazel's world expanded. She began to climb again, dragging herself into the lowest branches of a small oak, surveying her kingdom with the wary arrogance of her kind. Her limp was permanent, but it grew less pronounced. She learned to move quietly, to stalk in silence, to wait for her moment. Once, a pair of blue jays landed too close, pecking at fallen seeds. Hazel flattened herself, invisible in the grass, and watched with eyes like molten gold. One afternoon, the staff brought in a group of school children for a quiet tour. Megan spoke to them in low tones, explaining Hazel's story, her injury, her fight to survive. The children watched the enclosure with awe and concern. One little girl asked, "Will she ever go home?" Megan paused, looking through the glass at the bobcat hunched over a fresh kill. "That's the hope," she said softly, "but it's up to her." Hazel, for her part, ignored the humans. She was learning to be wild again, to trust her own instincts more than the patterns of captivity. But sometimes, in the quiet hour before dusk, she would pause in her patrol of the pen and glance toward the glass. There, always, was Megan, never closer, never gone. Watching, waiting, letting Hazel reclaim what had always been hers. With each passing day, the wild inside Hazel grew stronger. She still bore the marks of her ordeal, her limp, her scars, the memory of pain, but she also carried the fierce independence that had once defined her. Survival, she learned, was not a gift given by humans. It was a victory she would have to win for herself, over and over, in the delicate balance between hope and wildness. That night, as the wind shifted and the scent of coyote faded into memory, Hazel curled beneath a blanket of fern and leaf. For the first time in months, she slept without fear. Silver Pine Sanctuary hummed with an energy that Megan had rarely seen before. Word of Hazel's recovery had spread like wildfire through the small town, carried by the excited whispers of schoolchildren, local hikers, and volunteers who posted photos of distant glimpses on their social feeds. Even the sanctuary's website saw an unexpected spike in traffic after a journalist from the local paper wrote, "A wild heart heals at Silver Pine." Hazel, once an anonymous creature at the edge of survival, had become a symbol, though for what exactly depended on who you asked. Megan felt the shift first in the subtle pressure of staff meetings. "She's the best story we've had in years," the outreach manager said, tapping at his tablet. "We need more photos, maybe a short video for the visitors center." Another voice, wary and pragmatic, added, "People are asking if we're keeping her as a mascot, or if she'll be released. Some are saying she should be put down before she gets too tame." Megan sat back, resisting the urge to clench her fists. For weeks, she'd lived in the quiet rhythm of Hazel's rehabilitation. Small victories, slow trust, the fragile beauty of a wild thing choosing, every day, to keep fighting. Now the outside world pressed in, loud and impatient, wanting something clear and simple from a story that was neither. That pressure grew each day. Local TV crews started calling, requesting interviews, exclusive first looks, and promises of an update when a decision was made about Hazel's fate. Emails poured in, some heartfelt and hopeful, some suspicious, some outright angry. Sanctuary managers, not used to this kind of scrutiny, turned to Megan for answers. "We can't keep putting this off," the director told her in a tense meeting. "The board wants a plan by the end of the month. If Hazel can't be released, we need to decide what's best for her, and for us." Megan left that meeting with a headache pounding at her temples. She wandered out to the edge of the sanctuary, where the air was quieter and the only audience was the blackbirds calling from the fence posts. For a moment, she let herself rest, feeling the tension ease from her shoulders as she watched Baxter sniff among the wildflowers. She remembered what it had been like before, long before Hazel, before the storm, before the loss that had cracked her life in half. The work had always been about something larger, protecting wildness, holding space for the unknown. Now, with every reporter's question, every board member's anxious stare, Megan felt the ground shifting under her again. Inside the visitors' center, the atmosphere was electric. School groups pressed their faces to the glass, hoping to see Hazel pace or hunt. Some parents took selfies with the enclosure in the background, already composing captions about resilience and second chances. Other visitors shook their heads. "She's too used to people," one man muttered to his wife. "That animal will never make it out there." A heated debate had even erupted on a local Facebook group, some calling for Hazel's permanent protection, others demanding she be released before she lost her edge, and a small, louder minority accusing the sanctuary of turning a wild animal into a spectacle. Megan struggled with the attention. She knew that Hazel wasn't a lesson or a mascot or a miracle. She was just a creature, scarred and defiant, with the right to her own fate. Still, the pressure was real. The sanctuary depended on public goodwill and donations to survive. Every choice seemed fraught. Set Hazel free and risk her dying in the wild? Keep her in captivity and risk betraying everything the sanctuary stood for? In the chaos, Megan found an unlikely source of support. The sanctuary's youngest volunteers, students and interns, rallied around her and Hazel. They decorated Hazel's pen with wildflowers, carefully hidden so as not to intrude. One of them, a shy teen named April, painted a mural of a bobcat leaping across a canyon, bold and unafraid. When a TV news crew came to film, April held a hand-lettered sign to the camera: "Let wild things be wild." It moved Megan deeply. She gathered the volunteers in the break room one rainy afternoon, thanking them for seeing Hazel not as a symbol or a story, but as a living being. They talked about the other animals they'd cared for, the heartbreak and the hope of working with creatures who owed them nothing. "Hazel isn't ours to keep or display," Megan told them. "Our job is to help her remember what it means to be wild, even if it's hard for us to let go." But as the days slipped past, the pressure intensified. A special meeting of the board was called, with reporters waiting outside for the result. The sanctuary's director called Megan into her office. "We have to decide, Megan. The board wants you to present a recommendation. You're the one who knows her best. What's your call?" That night, Megan sat on her porch, cradling a mug of tea as the first spring rain fell. Baxter dozed at her feet, breathing in time with the quiet drip of water from the eaves. Letters from children and emails from strangers cluttered her phone. 1,000 opinions, none of them hers. She thought of her daughter, the way she'd hated the idea of being pitied or put on display, and understood a little of what Hazel must feel. By morning, Megan had her answer. She typed a letter to the board, clear and steady. Hazel is not a mascot or an exhibit. She is not here to teach us a lesson or to fill a gap in our story. Her wildness is not ours to judge. If she is ready, we owe her the chance to return to the wild, even if it means letting go. At the next meeting, Megan read her statement aloud. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, April and the young volunteers began to clap, others joining in, until even the director gave a reluctant nod. Later that week, as the sun rose over Silver Pine, Megan stood at Hazel's pen. The bobcat watched her from the tall grass, eyes wary but bright. "You don't belong to anyone," Megan whispered. "You never did." In that moment, wild hope filled the air, fragile but stubborn, refusing to be tamed. Spring matured into the soft fullness of early summer. The grasses at Silver Pine swayed in gentle waves, sprinkled with wildflowers and buzzing with dragonflies. For Hazel, each day in the rewilding pen felt at once like progress and challenge. A steady stretching of her instincts, the gradual fading of old pain, and the sharpening awareness that her next test was not survival alone, but finding her place among her own kind. Megan had spent weeks consulting with sanctuary staff and regional wildlife experts. Their consensus was clear. For Hazel to have her best shot at life beyond the fence, she needed to relearn what it meant to be a bobcat, not in isolation, but alongside another of her species. Hazel had always been wary of humans, but her encounters with her own kind had been marked by caution and fear. The solution, as always, would require a risk. The candidate was Rusty, a broad-shouldered older male who'd been brought to the sanctuary the previous autumn, found injured by a roadside trap. Rusty's scars ran deeper than his tawny coat suggested, and he bore himself with the slow, wary wisdom of a survivor. In the first months after his arrival, he'd snarled at every handler, refusing food and hiding for days. But he had healed, and with time, his ferocity gave way to a steady, watchful calm. The first meeting between Hazel and Rusty was anything but peaceful. The sanctuary staff opened a sliding gate between their enclosures at dusk, when both cats were most alert, but also most hidden. For long minutes, neither moved. Hazel paced the far end of her pen, nose twitching, muscles bunched beneath her spotted pelt. Rusty sat on his haunches just inside the gate, watching, his tail flicking like a metronome. The air vibrated with their silent calculations, a language older than words. When they finally met in the middle, it was not with greeting, but with suspicion. Rusty flattened his ears and let out a low, throaty growl. Hazel arched her back, fur bristling, and snapped her jaws in warning. For a few tense moments, it seemed the experiment would end in blood and failure. But Rusty, perhaps remembering his own desperate days, turned aside first. He retreated to the far edge of the enclosure, leaving Hazel the prime territory beneath the old pine. She watched him, breathing hard, her body poised between fight and flight. Megan and Baxter observed from the blind, hearts pounding with every sign of tension. "It's okay," Megan murmured, mostly to herself. "Let them work it out." She knew better than to intervene. Wild things needed to find their own rules. That night, a sharp wind swept through the preserve. In the darkness, Coyotes sang from the far side of the fence, their calls rising in hungry crescendo. Hazel, shaken by the noise, crept beneath the pine, making herself small. Rusty, for his part, circled the pen twice, then stopped at the edge of Hazel's shelter. He stood sentinel, body tense, ears swiveling toward the unseen threat. When a shadow darted across the fence, a coyote hoping for an easy meal, Rusty lashed his tail, his presence alone enough to send the scavenger running. Hazel watched all of this from beneath the branches, her fear gradually melting into something like respect. By morning, she had not slept, but she no longer trembled. When Rusty padded away from the pine at dawn, she followed at a distance, their paths parallel but no longer colliding. Over the next week, a wary alliance took shape. The two bobcats circled each other, sharing space but not trust. Hazel watched Rusty hunt, mimicking his silent stalk through tall grass. When he caught a mouse and left its carcass behind, Hazel claimed the prize, not as a gift, but as an earned inheritance. Sometimes they sparred. A quick swipe of claws, a low growl, a bounding leap away. But each day, the tension softened. Hazel's limp was still visible, but her movements grew quicker, more sure. She learned from Rusty's efficiency, his keen sense for threats, his refusal to be intimidated by barking dogs or the thrum of distant machinery. For Megan, the transformation was bittersweet. From her post behind the observation glass, she watched the bond form, pride swelling in her chest, mixed with a strange, lingering ache. Hazel was less interested in the sound of Megan's voice now, less likely to look toward the glass when the staff came by. The time Megan spent reading to Hazel, sharing quiet evenings and soft words, was replaced by silent, wild companionship. One afternoon, Megan caught herself almost wishing Hazel would turn back, just for a second, and acknowledge the bond they'd built. But she knew better. She had seen the wild hunger return to Hazel's eyes, the restless pacing, the cautious independence. What she felt was not rejection, but success. The more Hazel relied on her instincts and less on human help, the closer she was to being ready for the world beyond. Still, Megan couldn't help but feel a pang of loss. Baxter seemed to sense her mood. On the days when Hazel and Rusty curled together under the pine or vanished from view for hours at a time, Baxter would nudge Megan's hand with his nose, seeking her attention. They'd walk the perimeter together, Megan telling herself that the ache was a sign of growth, not just for Hazel, but for herself as well. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold, Hazel and Rusty lay side by side beneath the old pine, their bodies nearly touching. It was not affection, at least not in the way humans understood, but a truce, an acceptance that survival was easier together than alone. Megan watched from the shadows, a witness to the wild rules of kinship and independence. She whispered, "You're ready for whatever comes next." The words faded on the breeze, carried off through the pines and into the untamed world beyond the fence. In that stillness, the sanctuary's promise was kept. Hazel was not tamed, not owned, but returned to the wild, to herself, and to the uncertain, thrilling possibility of a life unbound. Sunrise at Silver Pine was different that morning. A hush of anticipation settled over the sanctuary, as if every tree and every animal felt the coming change. The air was cool but gentle, laced with the sweetness of thawing earth and the distant calls of robins. In the rewilding enclosure, Hazel paced along the fence line, muscles taut beneath her healed, scarred fur. Beside her, Rusty watched the horizon with a stillness that came from age and experience. Today, the gate would open, Preparations had been underway for weeks. Megan met with wildlife officials, tracked weather forecasts, and mapped out a corridor from the sanctuary deep into protected lands where few humans wandered. She assembled a quiet team, veterinarians, volunteers, local biologists, and gave each a role, making it clear that there would be no ceremony, no crowd, no bright lights or clapping children. This moment belonged to the bobcats, not to the humans who'd cared for them. Still, word had gotten out. The story of Hazel, the battered bobcat rescued from a storm, who had healed and fought her way back, had become legend in the community. Teachers planned to live stream the release to classrooms. News stations called, hoping for an interview. Megan set boundaries, allowing only a single camera to record from a distance, promising to share footage with everyone later. "This is not a show," she insisted. "It's a beginning." As the sun cleared the mountains, casting gold across the pines, the team gathered by the gate. Megan knelt in the grass, her hands steady but her heart pounding so hard she thought someone would hear it. She looked at Hazel, stronger now, her limp a memory rather than a hindrance, and then at Rusty, who stood as her silent shield. Baxter, as always, sat at Megan's side, watching with loyal, calm eyes. Hazel sensed something different. She paused in her pacing, nose lifted to the air, ears swiveling. The scent of dew, of rabbits hiding in the brush, of wind moving through open country, it all beckoned her. She glanced once at Rusty, then toward the cluster of humans beyond the fence, their faces hopeful and anxious. Megan rose and nodded to the staff at the gate. The latch slid open with a soft, metallic click. The moment seemed to freeze. Hazel's muscles bunched, her tail flicked, and her whole body trembled with the old, wild longing. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, glancing back, not at Megan, not at the past, but at the place where pain had given way to strength. Then, with a single leap, Hazel crossed the threshold, moving into the tall grass beyond the fence. Rusty was close behind, pausing only once to look back over his shoulder before slipping into the trees. The release was over in seconds. Megan stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. There was no dramatic farewell, no promise that Hazel would return. There was only the hush of the woods, the rustle of grass closing behind the two bobcats, and the first calls of songbirds echoing their freedom. Tears filled Megan's eyes, not of regret, but of pride, of awe at what survival and trust could create together. All the months of tending, all the sleepless nights, the heartbreak and hope, everything came to this. A leap into the wild, a vanishing tale, the acceptance that letting go was the only way forward. Across the region, classrooms erupted with applause as teachers projected the grainy livestream. Children pressed their hands to the screens, cheering for Hazel and Rusty, as if they were watching old friends set off on a great adventure. Emails and messages poured into the sanctuary. "Thank you for letting her be wild. Hazel gives us hope. My students want to protect every animal now." Megan let herself sit in the grass, her legs trembling. Baxter nudged her hand with his nose and rested his head in her lap, anchoring her to the present. She stroked his fur, grateful for his silent comfort. For a moment, she let the grief rise. Grief for her daughter, for all the things she could not hold on to, for every wild thing that must leave. She breathed through it, letting it mingle with gratitude and a fierce, stubborn hope. Later that day, the sanctuary was quiet. The staff packed up the cameras and closed the empty pen. Megan wandered the grounds, listening to the wind, watching the shifting patterns of light and shadow. She thought of Hazel, somewhere in the woods now, free, at risk, but wholly herself. She wondered if Hazel would remember the humans who had saved her, or if memory would dissolve in the urgent rhythms of wildlife. She hoped secretly that the bond they'd shared would last in some small, mysterious way. That night, Megan stood at the edge of the sanctuary, the sky burning with stars. She listened for sounds, a distant yowl, a break in the brush, but there was only the whisper of wind through the pines. Baxter leaned against her leg, his body warm, his loyalty unwavering. Megan spoke softly, her words meant for the wilds as much as for herself. Be brave. Be safe. Remember who you are. She knew that the release would become legend, a tale told at school assemblies, a story passed from parent to child, a lesson wrapped in wonder. But for Megan, it was something quieter and deeper. It was a lesson in trust, in letting go, in believing that every act of hope, no matter how small, could change the world for the better. And somewhere, beneath the wide Colorado sky, two bobcats melted into the dawn, the sanctuary gates open, the world stretching before them, unknown, unbound, and utterly beautifully wild. The first frost dusted Silver Pine Sanctuary, just as the leaves began their tumble from gold to brown. Each morning, the mountains emerged from a shroud of mist, the air sharp with promise and memory. It had been months since Hazel and Rusty slipped through the open gate and vanished into the freedom of the pines. For Megan, the days since their release were measured not in routine, but in echoes. Each sound, each shadow in the woods, stirring memories of a journey that had changed her, and she hoped, changed something in the world outside. On the porch of her cabin, Megan sat bundled in an old sweater, a mug of coffee warming her hands. Baxter lay at her feet, sighing with contentment, his fur dappled with the sunlight streaming through the pines. The mailbox bulged with envelopes, letters from school children, drawings of bobcats leaping across mountain streams, heartfelt notes from strangers who had followed Hazel's story from afar. Some messages arrived by email, others through the sanctuary's social pages, all filled with questions, thanks, and a quiet awe. Will Hazel ever come back? One child asked, in crayon handwriting. Do you think she remembers you? Wondered another. There were letters from grieving parents, from lonely retirees, from young people struggling to find hope. Somehow, the story of one wild cat had become a thread that tied distant lives together. Megan smiled at the letters, spreading them out across her lap. Each one was a reminder that Hazel's story was more than just an animal's recovery. It had become a testament to what it meant to fight, to risk, to care, when the outcome was never guaranteed. In the stillness of late fall, Megan often found herself reflecting on the months she'd spent with Hazel, the fear and frailty of that first stormy night, the sleepless vigils by the clinic glass, the cautious bridge of trust built one quiet moment at a time. Each memory returned with fresh clarity. Hazel's wild, frightened eyes meeting hers. The first twitch of the bobcat's tail in uncertain trust. The pride and heartbreak of letting go. With every memory came a lesson that reached far beyond the boundaries of the sanctuary. She realized, more than ever, that true compassion is not about control. It is not measured in how tightly you hold on, or how many lives you rescue, or how much you can fix. Instead, it's in the willingness to meet others where they are, to respect the wildness in them, the things you cannot tame or change. Megan had learned that lesson the hardest way possible years ago at her daughter's hospital bedside. Now, with Hazel, it took on new meaning. Sometimes love meant letting go, even when every part of you wanted to hold tight. She shared these thoughts with those who wrote to her, choosing her words carefully. Hazel taught me that you cannot keep what is wild, she wrote to a teacher in Denver, but you can care for it while it's with you. The rest is up to them. In a letter to a grieving mother, she wrote, "Sometimes, giving freedom is the most loving thing we can do, even if it breaks our hearts." Megan noticed her own healing, slow and quiet as winters approach. The ache she'd carried for years, the guilt and sorrow over her daughter, softened around the edges. It would never disappear. Grief, she knew, was not something you cured, but something you learned to carry. But Hazel's journey had become a mirror for her own. By helping the bobcat find her way back to the wild, Megan discovered she could also step into the future, trusting that hope was not a weakness, but a strength. Letters kept arriving. Children drew comics about Hazel the Brave. A veteran wrote to say the story had inspired him to start hiking again. College students emailed, asking for internships or advice on starting wildlife projects. Even tourists from out of state sent thank you notes after visiting the sanctuary, remarking on the sense of peace they'd found walking the trails, hearing Hazel's tale from the guides. Baxter, always near, seemed to know when Megan's mind drifted too far into the past. He would nudge her with his nose, insisting she join him for a walk or toss a stick down the muddy path. Sometimes, in the blue twilight, Megan and Baxter would sit together, listening to the sounds of the forest. She wondered if, somewhere out there, Hazel and Rusty might be watching, invisible but close. The sanctuary itself changed, too. Hazel's story inspired the staff to re-examine their mission. No longer was the goal simply to save and display. Now the focus was on rewilding, on helping each animal reclaim its wildness, even if that meant fewer chances for visitors to see them up close. The volunteers found pride in this new direction. April, the young intern who had painted the mural, wrote a new sign for the visitors' center. "The greatest gift we can give is freedom." One afternoon, as Megan sorted the last batch of letters, a group of children arrived for a tour. They peppered her with questions about Hazel, where she'd gone, what she was doing, if she'd ever be seen again. Megan answered as honestly as she could. "I don't know where Hazel is now," she told them, "but I hope she's wild and free. Some stories don't end in safety, they end in freedom. And that's the bravest story of all." As the group wandered off, Megan lingered on the porch, Baxter at her side, watching the leaves drift down in the wind. She thought about all that had changed since the night she found a frightened, broken bobcat beneath the pines. She knew the world would always hold danger and loss, but also beauty and the power of hope. In Hazel's wild journey, Megan found not just healing, but the courage to believe in new beginnings. She looked at the sky, golden with the late autumn sun, and whispered, "Thank you." It was a message to the wild, to the past, and to all the lives that Hazel's story had touched, including her own. Winter returned to Silver Pine with gentle certainty. The sanctuary's meadows lay beneath a new blanket of snow. Trees glittered with icy crystals, and animal tracks stitched wandering stories across the white. There was a hush in the air, a peace that came only after long struggle. The world had turned once more, but everything felt subtly changed, as if the land itself remembered the courage it had witnessed. Hazel and Rusty had not been seen for weeks. Sometimes, as the staff walked the perimeter or hiked along the trails, they'd catch glimpses, a pair of tawny shapes moving among the distant trees, a flash of gold eyes in the dusk. fresh tracks crossing an empty field after a heavy snow. Each sighting was fleeting, wild, impossible to confirm. Yet each one sent a ripple of excitement through the sanctuary. They are still out there, still free, still choosing the wild. Children visited the sanctuary even in the cold, their cheeks red with wind and excitement. They clustered around Baxter, the old golden retriever who had greeted so many visitors, his tail wagging, his patience endless. Megan often stood nearby, her own eyes bright with a joy she had thought lost forever. She listened as children shared stories they'd written or pictures they'd drawn. Hazel in a crown of wildflowers, Hazel leaping over mountains, Hazel curled beside Rusty beneath a full moon. The staff noticed the change as well. The sanctuary had grown quieter, more respectful of its residents. Fewer animals were kept as exhibits. More and more, the mission had shifted. Now the goal was always to heal, prepare, and release, never to keep. New volunteers arrived, inspired by Hazel's story and eager to learn how to help animals find their way back to freedom. The mural that April had painted, now retouched and bright beneath a canopy of icicle lights, had become a symbol, a wild heart, leaping beyond every fence. Megan found herself changed in ways she could hardly describe. For so long, her life had been marked by loss, her daughter's illness and passing, the slow withdrawal from the things she'd once loved, the ache that shadowed every hopeful moment. But Hazel's journey had become a kind of map, showing Megan the way through pain and back to possibility. She moved with new confidence, laughing more easily, lingering in conversation, feeling the world open up around her. She still walked the sanctuary's quiet trails in the early morning, Baxter always at her side. Sometimes, on especially still days, she would pause by the fence and listen for any sign, footsteps in the brush, a wild cry, a glimpse of movement where the forest grew thick. Each time she saw fresh tracks, she smiled, content not to follow, but simply to know that Hazel and Rusty were out there, living as they were meant to. One late afternoon, as the first big snow of the season began to fall, a group of children gathered in the visitor center, pressing close as Megan prepared to tell Hazel's story one more time. Their eyes were wide with expectation, their hands full of cocoa and notepads. Megan cleared her throat, glanced out at the swirling snow, and began. A long time ago, a little bobcat was lost and alone in a storm, fighting to survive. She was hurt and scared, and didn't know if she'd see the sun again. But with help and a lot of hope, she found her way through the darkness. She learned to trust, to heal, to be wild again. And when the time was right, we opened the gate. We set her free. She paused, searching the children's faces for understanding. Some stories don't end in safety. They end in freedom. And that's the bravest story of all. A little boy raised his hand. Do you miss her? Megan smiled, her voice soft and sure. Yes, but I'm also proud. Because real guardianship isn't about keeping things for ourselves. It's about letting go, even when it's hard. Every time we set something wild free, we make the world a little better. Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the sounds of the sanctuary, painting everything in a peaceful hush. Megan felt the warmth of the children's trust, the gentle pressure of Baxter's head against her knee, and the certainty that what they had done mattered. Over the next days, letters continued to arrive. Teachers from across the state wrote to thank the sanctuary for sharing Hazel's journey. Parents sent stories of how their children had found new courage, standing up to bullies, trying new things, refusing to give up. Some messages came from as far away as Canada or Mexico, from wildlife centers asking how to start their own rewilding programs. Megan's heart filled with quiet pride. She knew that Hazel's story would outlast any single winter. It was now woven into the sanctuary's purpose, a living legacy, proof that hope, patience, and the willingness to risk heartbreak could change the world. On the first truly clear morning after the storm, Megan walked out before sunrise. The snow was unbroken, glowing blue in the early light. She knelt by the edge of the woods, Baxter leaning into her side, both of them watching for any sign of life. Just as the sun tipped over the horizon, two shapes appeared between the trees. Quick, silent, wild, Hazel and Rusty. For a moment they stood on the crest of a small hill, golden eyes reflecting the dawn. Then, as if sensing Megan's presence, Hazel paused. Their eyes met across the snowy distance. No cage, no glass, no leash, just recognition, pure and profound. Hazel dipped her head, then melted into the trees, Rusty at her side. Megan rose, brushing snow from her knees. She felt no sadness, only a fierce, clear joy. She whispered, "Go well. Be free." Baxter barked once, tail waving in the morning sun. The sanctuary opened its gates to visitors that afternoon, welcoming children and families from every corner. Megan greeted each one, sharing stories of hope, of healing, of wild hearts set free. She told them what Hazel had taught her, and what she hoped they would remember. True guardianship is measured not by what we keep, but by what we set free. Every act of hope, no matter how small, can change a life, or even a world. And as the sanctuary buzzed with laughter and wonder, Megan knew that Hazel's legacy would endure. Carried on the wind, in the dreams of every wild thing, and in the hearts of all who dared to hope.